Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet journey in the Sleepless series, where history is not sharp or hurried, but soft, slow, and steady, a companion for restless nights. Wherever you are, take a moment now to settle. Lie back. Loosen the shoulders. Breathe in deeply and let it go. The day may have been long, perhaps heavy, perhaps full of noise. But here, in this gentle hour, there is no demand, no burden. Only calm words, flowing like a quiet river, meant to ease you into rest. Tonight, our path takes us to Florence. Picture the city at dusk. The narrow streets are glowing with lanterns. Shadows stretch softly against old stone walls. The river Arno drifts past, its surface darkening into silver, catching the last glimmers of evening light. Bridges arch across the water like resting silhouettes. Somewhere, a bell tolls, slow, unhurried, marking not just the hour, but the rhythm of a city settling into night. Florence was never only a place of merchants and markets. It was a stage of beauty, of art, of ideas. And in this stage, power did not always march with soldiers' boots. Sometimes it whispered with coins. Sometimes it appeared in the colors of paintings, in the arches of churches, in the very air of a family's name. This is the story of the Medici. Bankers, patrons, rulers, a family who turned money into memory and influence into eternity. Their hands guided Florence not always with force, but with the subtler tools of patronage, of faith, of art. And tonight, in this calm hour, we will walk through their world. So let the noise of the day fall away. Let the mind loosen as we wander together into lantern-lit streets and quiet palaces of long ago. And as we drift into their story, if these journeys bring you comfort, remember, gently, to like this video and to subscribe to Pattern of Power. It helps keep this small library of calm lessons alive, ready to meet you whenever the night feels heavy. Now, let us begin, in Florence, under the glow of lanterns, beside the quiet waters of the Arno. Chapter 1: A Family of Bankers. Florence, in the early 15th century, was a city alive with trade, with craft, with voices carrying across narrow streets. Its houses rose tall and close together, stone walls holding centuries of memory, wooden shutters opening each morning with the sun. The air filled quickly with sound, the clang of blacksmiths shaping iron, the hum of merchants setting out bolts of wool, the calls of vendors in the piazzas offering bread, olive oil, and wine. Children ran through the squares, their laughter weaving through the noise of business. The river Arno flowed steadily through the heart of the city, carrying barges loaded with goods, reflecting the bridges that linked Florence from one side to the other. Florence was a republic, or at least it called itself one. Councils met in stone halls. Citizens debated in guild meetings. Laws were passed, votes were cast, and the city celebrated its freedom. But beneath the public forms, everyone knew the truth. Florence was ruled as much by money as by councils. Wealth was the silent thread weaving through every decision. To lend was to lead. To extend credit was to shape loyalty. In Florence, to control money was, quietly, to control men. It was into this world that Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici came of age. The Medici family name was known, but not yet dominant. They had been merchants, sometimes successful, sometimes not, part of the fabric of Florentine life but not its center. Giovanni inherited neither crown nor castle. What he carried was something subtler, vision. He understood, with patience, that money was more than currency. It was a key. Used carefully, it could unlock doors not only in Florence but across Europe. Giovanni founded the Medici Bank. At first, it seemed modest, even ordinary: deposits, loans, accounts carefully written in ledgers. But Giovanni's genius was not simply in numbers. It was in trust. Florence was full of bankers, but not all were trusted. Many chased quick profit, taking risks that collapsed fortunes overnight. Giovanni was different. He moved cautiously. He lent with care. He turned away reckless ventures. And above all, he treated those who borrowed from him with fairness, ensuring that their confidence in him grew year after year. In a city where reputations rose and fell quickly, trust was everything. And so, slowly, steadily, Giovanni gathered clients of weight. Merchants carrying wool into northern Europe used his letters of credit. Guilds placed their funds with him. Families of influence borrowed from him, knowing that his patience matched his prudence. And then, greater figures came: kings, who needed gold to sustain their wars; princes, who needed credit to build their courts; and above all, the Pope himself, the head of Christendom. To lend to the Pope was more than a transaction. It was an entry into the sacred heart of Europe. Giovanni handled papal accounts with care, ensuring that revenues were collected, soldiers were paid, and the machinery of the church remained steady. In doing so, he clothed the Medici Bank in invisible sanctity. If the Pope trusted Giovanni, others would follow. A banker of Florence had become the banker of Christendom. The Medici Bank expanded outward. Branches opened in Venice, Rome, Naples, Geneva, Bruges, even London. Clerks traveled with sealed letters, carrying credit across mountains and seas. Florentine florins, steady and golden, passed through their hands, moving into every corner of Europe. The Medici became not simply bankers of a city, but bankers of a world. And yet Giovanni himself remained modest. In a Florence fiercely protective of its republican image, arrogance was dangerous. Families who flaunted themselves too openly were often punished by envy, sometimes even by exile. Giovanni avoided such mistakes. His house was comfortable but not ostentatious. His clothing was fine but plain. He walked the streets quietly, speaking as one citizen among many. In councils, he did not dominate. In piazzas, he did not proclaim. His power was disguised, his wealth understated, his influence woven gently into the daily life of the city. This modesty made him beloved. Florentines looked upon him not as a tyrant but as one of their own. A man who prospered, yes, but who carried his prosperity with humility. A man whose success seemed not to diminish Florence, but to strengthen it. And so the Medici name began to change. No longer just another merchant family, they became pillars of Florence itself. Men in council whispered of Giovanni's opinion. Guild leaders who owed him their fortunes spoke on his behalf. His hand guided the city, but so quietly that Florence believed it was still free. This was the genius of Giovanni di Bicci. He did not seize power. He seeped into it. Coins became influence. Ledgers became levers. Quiet wealth became power. The bank itself became one of the most respected institutions in Europe. Its clerks, trained with precision, recorded accounts that shaped diplomacy as much as business. A prince who borrowed from Giovanni was bound to him not only by debt but by dependence. A monarch who relied on his credit found his decisions subtly tied to Florentine interests. And the Pope, whose treasury moved through Medici hands, gave the family a reach that extended beyond city walls, beyond kingdoms, into the very soul of Christendom. And still Giovanni remained steady, almost invisible. He held no throne, wore no crown, declared no title of lordship. Florence remained a republic in name. Councils met, guilds debated, offices rotated. But decisions bent toward him. Outcomes favored his allies. The balance of power curved gently around the Medici, like a river bending quietly around a rock. In Giovanni's lifetime, the Medici Bank became the financial heartbeat of Europe. Letters bearing his seal traveled farther than armies. Contracts signed in his name outlasted treaties. His clerks, sitting in quiet rooms by candlelight, moving numbers from one column to another, carried more weight than soldiers with swords. Such was the nature of his power, invisible, patient, enduring. When Giovanni died in 1429, he left behind not only wealth but legitimacy. His sons inherited more than a bank. They inherited a foundation upon which a dynasty could be built. Florence did not yet call them rulers, but it already moved to their rhythm. The Medici name, once ordinary, had become extraordinary. And the lesson of Giovanni's life remains clear: quiet wealth can build louder power. The Medici did not begin as kings. They began as bankers. And yet by turning coin into trust, trust into influence, and influence into identity, they planted seeds that grew into a dynasty remembered for centuries. Their story began not with thunder, but with whispers. Not with swords, but with ledgers. Not with conquest, but with the simple trust between lender and borrower. And from those whispers, Florence's future was written. And so, in the lantern glow of Florentine streets, one could almost sense it. The family who counted coins by candlelight would, in time, count themselves among the rulers of history. Chapter 2: Cosimo de' Medici, the Elder. Florence in the early 15th century was a city poised between tradition and transformation. The narrow streets twisted between stone houses that bore the marks of centuries of merchant life. Shops spilled into piazzas, their stalls piled with wool, cloth, and spices, while the river Arno moved slowly past, carrying barges loaded with goods from distant lands. To the casual eye, Florence appeared a republic alive with freedom. Councils met in echoing chambers, guilds protected their crafts, elections were held with ritual formality. Citizens prided themselves on equality, and the word tyrant was uttered as if it were a curse. Yet beneath this proud republican image, power had always flowed through hidden channels. Influence was carried less by votes than by money. The city could celebrate its freedom, but it was also a place where wealth whispered more loudly than laws, where patronage was more effective than force, and where the appearance of equality could be carefully maintained while quiet hierarchies took root. It was into this Florence that Cosimo de' Medici rose to prominence. He was the son of Giovanni di Bicci, the banker whose prudence and patience had already transformed the Medici family from respectable merchants into one of the most trusted financial houses in Europe. Giovanni had built the foundations with care, always modest in appearance, careful never to appear too princely in a city allergic to arrogance. Cosimo inherited not only a thriving bank, but a philosophy that wealth, when carried with restraint and humility, could reach further than any crown. Yet where Giovanni had been cautious, Cosimo possessed vision. He understood that banking could be more than transactions, more than ledgers filled with balances. Money, he realized, could be transformed into something lasting, something that reached beyond contracts and numbers. It could be turned into patronage, into architecture, into beauty, into legitimacy. Coins could be melted not into gold alone, but into trust, loyalty, and even memory. By the early 15th century, the Medici Bank was not merely a Florentine institution. It was the financial heart of Europe. Branches stretched outward like veins from the body of the city. Venice, Milan, Rome, Geneva, Bruges, London. Kings and popes borrowed from the Medici. Merchants relied on their letters of credit to carry goods across mountains and seas. The papacy itself entrusted its treasury to their care, a relationship that carried the Medici name into the sacred center of Christendom. To hold papal accounts was to carry not just financial authority, but a kind of spiritual legitimacy, as if God's own house had endorsed the family's reliability. Yet Cosimo understood that banking alone, even at this scale, could not secure permanent influence. Money was powerful, but money was also fragile, easily lost, quickly spent, always shifting. To root power more deeply, wealth had to be rebranded into something more enduring. Cosimo's answer was patronage. Florence was a republic in form, but it was also a city of appearances. It was fiercely proud of its art, its architecture, its festivals, its culture. Citizens looked to beauty as proof of greatness. To shape Florence's image was to shape Florence itself. Cosimo did not claim titles of lordship. He did not march with armies. Instead, he poured wealth into works that made the city more splendid, while at the same time binding its identity to the Medici name. Each gift he gave was not only generous, it was political. Every chapel, every library, every commission reminded Florence of who had made it possible. Cosimo's power was written into stone, pigment, and parchment, visible everywhere yet spoken of softly. Nowhere was this more visible than in the story of the dome. 4 years, the great cathedral of Florence, Santa Maria del Fiora, had stood unfinished. Its vast base, built with ambition, waited for a crown that no builder seemed able to provide. The space to be covered was too wide, the techniques of the ancients forgotten. Some said that the city had been too bold, that the cathedral would never be complete, that Florence would forever stand beneath a structure that was magnificent yet headless. The dome was a dream deferred, a promise unfulfilled. Then came Filippo Brunelleschi, a man of unorthodox genius. His designs were daring, his methods untested. He envisioned a double shell, supported by hidden ribs, rising without scaffolding, curving higher than any had thought possible. Many dismissed him as reckless. Others mocked his arrogance. But Cosimo saw in him the key to Florence's destiny. He placed his trust and his fortune in Brunelleschi's vision. Year after year, brick upon brick, the dome rose. Its lines curved upward in defiance of doubt, its form swelling into the sky. Skeptics who had jeered were silenced as the structure took shape. By the time it was complete, Florence stood transformed. The Republic of Merchants and Guilds had crowned itself with one of the greatest architectural achievements of the age. The dome became the symbol of the city, a silhouette recognized across Italy, a beacon to travelers, a wonder to all who saw it. And though Brunelleschi's genius made it possible, it was Cosimo's patronage that allowed it to rise. The Medici were tied forever to the cathedral's glory. Florence appeared eternal, and in its eternity, the Medici found their legitimacy. Cosimo's patronage extended beyond architecture. He gathered thinkers and philosophers, turning Florence into the center of Europe's intellectual revival. He supported Marsilio Ficino, who translated Plato and revived the wisdom of antiquity, weaving it into the fabric of Renaissance humanism. He commissioned the collection of manuscripts, filling libraries with knowledge that had been scattered and neglected. The Medici Library, one of the first truly public libraries in Europe, opened its doors to scholars, ensuring that learning was not locked away but shared. In this way, Cosimo rebranded wealth into wisdom. To be Medici was not only to be rich, but to be cultured, enlightened, generous. Florence itself became a city of learning, its reputation elevated by Cosimo's vision. He also funded convents, hospitals, and charities. The poor prayed for his soul, the sick blessed his generosity, the ordinary citizens saw in him not a tyrant but a benefactor. In a republic where open rule would have been condemned, Cosimo made himself indispensable by seeming to give more than he took. The city believed itself free, but the Florence it walked through, the churches, the libraries, the artworks, was the Florence of Cosimo's design. Opposition became difficult not because he silenced it with force, but because to resist him was to resist the very beauty and prosperity of the city. Yet his life was not free of danger. Rival families, envious of his influence, feared that he sought tyranny. The Albizzi, one of Florence's most powerful clans, accused him of overreaching. In 1433, Cosimo was arrested and imprisoned in the tower of the Palazzo Vecchio. 4 days, his fate hung in balance. His enemies demanded his execution. Whispers spread through the city. Would the Medici be destroyed at the height of their rise? But Cosimo's wealth, his alliances, his careful network of obligations, all came to his aid. Bribes softened some, loyalty secured others, and the risk of making him a martyr deterred the rest. Instead of death, Cosimo faced exile. Exile could have been the end. Many families had been cast from Florence, never to return. But Cosimo's exile lasted only a year. He went to Venice, where he waited with patience. Florence, without him, faltered. The Medici bank had been too deeply tied to the city's fortunes. Trade slowed. Confidence waned. Political life grew unstable. The Republic discovered that its proud independence was fragile without the steady hand of Cosimo's patronage. Within a year, the city recalled him. He returned not as a defeated man, but as a savior. From that moment, his authority was beyond question. And yet, again, he avoided the trap of open domination. He did not seize titles. He did not abolish councils. Florence remained a republic in name and form. Elections continued, offices rotated, guilds met. But beneath the surface, Cosimo's influence shaped everything. His allies found themselves in key positions, his opponents quietly pushed aside. Decisions bent toward him, not by decree, but by consensus engineered through trust and necessity. Florence remained Florence, but in truth, it was Cosimo's city. By the time of his death in 1464, Cosimo was mourned not as a tyrant, not as a banker, but as a father. The people called him Pater Patri, father of the fatherland. It was a title more powerful than any crown, because it had not been imposed. It had been given. His funeral was not only the passing of a man, but the recognition of a truth, that he had become the quiet architect of Florence's greatness. The lesson of Cosimo's life is clear. Patronage becomes politics. Wealth, when transformed into beauty, becomes legitimacy. A dome can be as strong as an army. A library can be as persuasive as a speech. A chapel can secure loyalty more deeply than gold. Cosimo rebranded power itself. He showed that to lead Florence was not to conquer it, but to adorn it. Not to claim it openly, but to beautify it. Not to command it, but to leave gifts so enduring that the city itself carried his memory forward. And so Cosimo the Elder stands in history not as a king, not as a tyrant, but as something subtler, something greater. He became the father of Florence, a man who proved that true power does not always march or roar. Sometimes it builds. Sometimes it funds. Sometimes it gifts. And in doing so, it becomes part of the stones, the streets, and the soul of a city. Chapter 3: Lorenzo the Magnificent. Florence in the late 15th century glowed with a brilliance unlike any other city in Europe. Its narrow streets, lined with stone houses and bustling workshops, carried not only the voices of merchants and bankers, but also the brushstrokes of painters, the chisels of sculptors, the verses of poets, and the philosophical debates of scholars. The city had grown wealthy through trade and finance, but its wealth was now transformed into something more, a flowering of beauty, of culture, of imagination that the world would one day call the Renaissance. At the center of this radiant moment stood Lorenzo de' Medici. He was called Illinois Magnifico, the Magnificent. It was not a name he claimed for himself, but one that others gave him, and it reflected not only his wealth, but the aura of refinement, generosity, and brilliance that surrounded him. Under Lorenzo, Florence reached the height of Medici power. It was not power won through crowns, armies, or conquest, but through culture. He understood, perhaps more than any of his ancestors, that beauty could be more persuasive than force, and that patronage could secure loyalty more deeply than law. Lorenzo was born in 1449, into a Florence already shaped by his grandfather Cosimo's quiet rule. From an early age, he was prepared for leadership. His education blended practical knowledge with humanist ideals. He learned not only the languages of commerce and politics, but also Latin, philosophy, poetry, and the arts. Tutors introduced him to the works of classical antiquity, while his family immersed him in the practical realities of banking and governance. He grew up among artists and scholars who came regularly to the Medici palaces, men who debated Plato, translated ancient manuscripts, and painted visions of myth and faith upon the walls. From childhood, Lorenzo understood that to be Medici was not only to be wealthy, but to stand at the center of Florence's identity. By the time he assumed leadership of the family in the 1460s, the Medici Bank was vast, and their name was already synonymous with Florence. But Lorenzo was not content simply to continue. He sought to elevate both Florence and his family to new heights. His fortune was not locked away in coffers. To Lorenzo, wealth was not meant to be hoarded, but spent, and spent with purpose. It was the lifeblood of Florence itself. To spend was to shape. To give was to guide. And so, he poured his resources into art, architecture, philosophy, and poetry. His court became a gathering place for some of the greatest minds and talents of the age. Sandro Botticelli painted under his patronage, producing works that still define Renaissance art. His Primavera and Birth of Venus, filled with mythological figures bathed in soft light, carried whispers of Medici taste into eternity. A young Michelangelo lived for years in the Medici household, sculpting in gardens filled with ancient statues, encouraged by Lorenzo himself, who saw genius in the boy and treated him almost as a son. Leonardo da Vinci, restless and brilliant, found opportunities within Lorenzo's Florence, sketching inventions, painting portraits, and experimenting with ideas in an atmosphere that welcomed innovation. But Lorenzo's patronage extended beyond individual artists. He supported architects who designed churches and palaces that reshaped Florence's skyline. He funded philosophers like Marsilio Ficino, who translated Plato into Latin and infused Renaissance thought with ancient wisdom. He collected manuscripts from across Europe and the East, filling libraries with treasures of knowledge, ensuring that Florence became not only a city of wealth, but a city of learning. The Medici Library opened its doors to scholars who might otherwise never have touched such texts. Knowledge, once hoarded by monasteries, was shared, and Florence became the intellectual capital of the Renaissance. Lorenzo himself was not content merely to sponsor culture, he participated in it. He wrote poetry in Italian, blending the elegance of classical form with the vividness of his own imagination. His verses were read aloud in gatherings, celebrated in courts, and shared in festivals. He composed songs that were performed at public celebrations, ensuring that his voice was part of Florence's cultural chorus. He delighted in festivals, organizing elaborate processions, carnivals, and tournaments that filled the city with music, dance, and theater. In Lorenzo's time, Florence was not only a city of commerce, It was a stage, and life itself felt like a performance of magnificence. Yet Florence was never a city of simple unity. Beneath its brilliance, rivalry simmered. Florence was proud of its republican traditions, proud of its independence, proud of its competitiveness. Families jostled for influence, guilds guarded their power, and resentment toward Medici dominance grew quietly in corners of the city. For some, Lorenzo's magnificence was not a gift, but a shadow. His generosity made Florence radiant, but it also reminded rivals of how dependent the city had become on a single family. Envy and fear grew together, like a fire smoldering unseen. This fire burst into flame in 1478, with what history remembers as the Pazzi conspiracy. On a Sunday in April, the people of Florence gathered in the great cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore. The vast space echoed with chants, and incense drifted upward into Brunelleschi's dome. Lorenzo stood with his younger brother Giuliano, unaware that the cathedral was about to become a battlefield. Members of the Pazzi family, ancient rivals of the Medici, had conspired with allies, including clerics and even whispers of foreign support, to destroy the Medici brothers in one swift blow. Their plan was audacious, almost unthinkable, to kill Lorenzo and Giuliano in the very heart of Florence, during Mass, in the presence of God and the people. As the sacred rites unfolded, the signal was given. Steel flashed in the dim light. Giuliano was attacked first, stabbed again and again until he collapsed lifeless onto the cathedral floor. Blood spread across the stones, mingling with incense, shocking the congregation into screams and chaos. Lorenzo, too, was attacked, but he moved quickly. Slashed across the neck, he warded off blows, retreating into the safety of the sacristy with loyal supporters. He was wounded, but alive. The conspiracy had failed in the most important respect. Florence still had its magnificence. The aftermath was swift and merciless. The city, far from rallying to the Pazzi, turned on them with fury. The conspirators were captured, tried, and executed. Their bodies were hung from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria, their name destroyed. The plot that was meant to break Medici power instead deepened it. Florence now saw in Lorenzo not only a patron, but a survivor, a man who had been attacked in sacred space and lived. The blood of Giuliano stained the stones, but the Medici name stood stronger than ever. The lesson was written clearly in those days. Power rooted in culture cannot be easily undone. Lorenzo was not simply a banker or a politician. He had become the soul of Florence's artistic flowering, the patron whose gifts touched every corner of the city. To strike at him was not merely to strike at a man, but to wound Florence itself. And so the people clung to him more tightly than ever. In the years that followed, Lorenzo not only preserved his authority but expanded his influence beyond Florence. He became a statesman of Italy, balancing the fragile peace between rival states. Through diplomacy, marriages, and alliances, he kept Florence secure in a peninsula torn between Naples, Milan, Venice, and the papacy. He negotiated with kings and popes, often turning enemies into reluctant allies. Abroad, his reputation was not only that of a wealthy man, but of a leader whose refinement and wisdom gave weight to his words. Princes respected him not because he commanded armies, but because he embodied a culture that all admired. At home, his patronage never ceased. Chapels glowed with frescoes. Sculptures filled gardens. Libraries grew heavier with manuscripts. Festivals continued, binding the people of Florence not only through loyalty but through joy. In Lorenzo's Florence, the ordinary citizen could feel part of something extraordinary. The city itself had become a masterpiece, and its guiding hand was the magnificent. When Lorenzo died in 1492, Florence mourned as though the sun had set. He was remembered not only as a ruler, but as a father, a poet, a patron, a protector of culture. His death left a void no one could truly fill. Yet his legacy lived on in every brushstroke, every carved stone, every note of music that echoed through the city's streets. Florence itself had been reshaped by his vision, and that reshaping could not be undone. The story of Lorenzo the Magnificent teaches a truth as enduring as stone. Power is not always secured by armies or laws. It can be secured by beauty, by culture, by the quiet binding of a people's identity to the generosity of one family. Even blades drawn in sacred places could not sever that bond. Lorenzo showed the world that patronage itself could be politics, that art could be armor, that culture could be crown. And so Florence, for centuries after, remembered him not simply as a man of wealth, but as the magnificent, the one who turned a city of merchants into a city of masterpieces, and in doing so, taught history that the soft glow of beauty can outlast the sharp edge of swords. Chapter 4: Medici and the Church. The Medici story began with coins in ledgers and contracts written in careful hands. It moved from merchant stalls and banking houses into palaces and chapels. It grew from quiet wealth into public magnificence, turning Florence into a city of domes, libraries, and paintings. Yet for all their success in banking and in Florence itself, the Medici were never content with boundaries. Their vision was wider. Their reach extended beyond the city walls. And in time, they would step into the very heart of Christendom. Two sons of Florence, born into a family of bankers and patrons, would rise to sit upon the throne of Saint Peter. They would wear the white robes of the papacy. They would be called popes. And in doing so, they would clothe their family name not only in wealth and culture, but in holiness itself. This transformation marked the Medici at their most ambitious. Power over Florence was one thing, influence in trade and politics another. But to ascend to the papacy was to claim a voice over the souls of Europe. The bank had given them gold, patronage had given them glory, but the church gave them something still greater, divine authority. The first of these papal Medici was Giovanni de' Medici, second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Giovanni was not raised as a soldier or as a statesman. From childhood, his father had marked him for the church. At the age of 13, he had been made a cardinal, more a promise of future power than an active role. He grew up surrounded by scholars, philosophers, and artists, breathing the air of the Florentine Renaissance. He carried himself with refinement, loved poetry and spectacle, and absorbed deeply the humanist culture of his father's court. When he was elected Pope in 1513, taking the name Leo X, the world took notice. He was young, cultured, and full of the energy of Florence. He entered the Vatican not as a stern ascetic, but as a patron of brilliance. Under his leadership, the papal court became a stage of magnificence. Ceremonies glittered with music, color, and pageantry. The Vatican was not only a seat of prayer, it was a palace of culture, echoing with the laughter of poets and the footsteps of artists summoned to leave their mark. Leo X continued the great project of St. Peter's Basilica, which had been begun by his predecessors. The basilica had already risen in part, but under Leo its momentum quickened. To oversee its crowning feature, the dome, he turned to Michelangelo, the same Michelangelo who had grown as a boy in the gardens of Lorenzo, sketching ancient statues and sculpting under Medici patronage. Now, the young artist returned, his genius enlisted to raise the most important church in Christendom. Under his hands, designs for the dome took shape, echoing the grandeur of Brunelleschi's in Florence, but intended on a scale that would awe the entire Catholic world. To walk through the Vatican during Leo XS papacy was to feel not only the presence of God, but also the taste of Florence. Walls glowed with frescoes, chapels shimmered with marble, music drifted through the air in endless masses and processions. Color, form, and light were as much a part of worship as prayer and scripture. The Medici knew what this meant. Faith was more than doctrine. It was spectacle, or was as binding as belief. To clothe the church in beauty was to bind Christians not only by fear of sin or hope of salvation, but by the sheer splendor of what they saw. Leo X made Rome into a theater of faith, and he cast the Medici as its leading patrons. But magnificence has its costs. The building of St. Peter's, the patronage of artists, the festivals, the rituals, all demanded money, and in vast quantities. Even popes needed revenue. And so the church turned increasingly to indulgences, payments made by the faithful in exchange for promises of spiritual relief, a remission of sins for themselves or their loved ones. To peasants and princes alike, the transaction seemed simple. Coins placed upon the altar became stones in St. Peter's Basilica. Gold sent to Rome became paint upon canvas, marble in chapels, music in choirs. For a time, the system held. Rome gleamed, and the flow of money supported its magnificence. But beneath the surface, discontent stirred. In Germany, in 1517, a monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of a church in Wittenberg. His words were sharp and uncompromising. He denounced indulgences as corruption, a mockery of true faith. He called for a return to purity, to scripture, to simplicity. His protest struck a chord. It spread like fire through a forest of dry branches, carried by the new printing presses into towns and villages across Europe. The Reformation was born, and at its heart, though not its only cause, was the extravagance of Leo's Rome. The Medici Pope had made the church dazzling, but in doing so, he had exposed it to accusations of vanity and greed. The Medici had reached the heights of Christendom, but they had also stepped into storm. When Leo died in 1521, another Medici soon followed him onto the papal throne. Clement VII, born Giulio de' Medici, nephew of Lorenzo the Magnificent, was elected pope in 1523. He was cautious, intelligent, and deeply aware of the dangers facing the Church. By his time, the Reformation had already spread far beyond Germany. Kings and princes were aligning themselves with Luther's cause, not only out of conviction but out of politics. Some saw in Protestantism a chance to free themselves from Rome's influence. The unity of European faith, long assumed to be unbreakable, was fracturing. Clement's reign was marked not only by this spiritual division, but by worldly fire as well. In 1527, catastrophe struck. The armies of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, marched upon Rome. They were unpaid, restless, and violent. The Eternal City, which had been filled with splendor under Leo, was torn apart. Churches were looted, palaces burned, sacred relics desecrated. Priests and nuns were slaughtered or scattered. For months, the papacy itself seemed destroyed, its grandeur reduced to ashes. Clement took refuge in the Castel Sant'Angelo, watching helplessly as the city burned. The spectacle of Leo's Rome was replaced by devastation so complete that many believed the papacy might never recover. Yet Clement endured. Slowly, painfully, he rebuilt authority. Even amid ashes, the papal throne remained a symbol too powerful to erase. He continued to navigate the shifting alliances of Europe, to defend what was left of Catholic unity, to preserve the Medici presence within the Church. His papacy, though scarred by crisis, proved that even when grandeur falls, authority can survive. Through both Leo and Clement, the Medici discovered something profound, that wealth, when cloaked in holiness, could reach further than any army. Florence had been their city. The bank had been their instrument. Art had been their language. But the papacy was their crown without calling it such. It allowed them to shape not only politics or trade, but the very souls of Europe. The lesson was clear, though its price was high. Rebranding wealth as holiness stretches power further than any sword. By stepping into the papacy, the Medici gave their family name a new aura. They were no longer bankers, no longer merely patrons of art. They were shepherds of souls, guardians of salvation, voices of God upon earth. Even if their actions were worldly, their titles were divine. It was, however, a fragile balance. The same magnificence that clothed St. Peter's also fueled the anger of reformers. The same authority that crowned Florence with glory also drew it into conflict. For a time, the Medici held both Rome and Florence, both culture and church. And in that union, their power reached further than ever before. But it also brought them into storms that reshaped the entire history of Europe. Even so, the stones of Florence and the domes of Rome still carry their mark. In every fresco painted under papal commission, in every column raised in St. Peter's, in every manuscript preserved in Medici libraries, their presence endures. The family that had once counted coins in dimly lit banking houses ended by placing crowns upon altars. And in this, they revealed again the subtle truth, that power survives when it finds a new robe to wear. The robe of banker had given way to the robe of patron. The robe of patron gave way to the robe of pope. Each transformation stretched the Medici name further, reshaping it, rebinding it, carrying it forward. The lesson is gentle but firm. Patronage becomes politics. And when patronage is bound to faith, politics becomes divine. For the Medici, art was never only beauty, it was legitimacy. Faith was never only prayer, it was authority. Thus Florence reached Rome, and the Medici reached heaven, or at least, the throne that claimed to guide souls toward it. And in quiet reflection, we see the pattern once more. Wealth, clothed in holiness, stretches power further than any sword. Chapter 5. Decline and Return. Every family that rises also falters. Every dynasty that grows also faces storms. The Medici, who had guided Florence through banking, patronage, and even papal crowns, were no exception. By the end of the 15th century, their hold on Florence began to weaken. Lorenzo the Magnificent, who had embodied the family's golden age, died in 1492. His death left a void that his heirs could not easily fill. His son, Piero, lacked his father's steadiness and his grandfather's caution. Florence, always proud of its independence, grew restless beneath Medici influence. And beyond Florence, Europe itself was changing. Kings and armies pressed into Italy. The old balance of city-states began to tremble. In 1494, the storm broke. Charles VIII of France led his armies across the Alps, descending into Italy with the thunder of cannon and the clatter of cavalry. Florence, caught in the path, turned against Piero de' Medici. He fled the city, abandoning the palaces and chapels his family had adorned for generations. For the first time in nearly a century, the Medici were cast out. Florence declared itself a republic again. The bells rang, not for Medici rule, but for freedom. Crowds filled the piazzas with cheers of liberation. And in this new atmosphere, fiery voices rose. Among them was the Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola, who preached against corruption, against excess, against the very splendor the Medici had embodied. Under his influence, Florence turned austere. Bonfires consumed paintings, books, clothing, anything deemed vanity. The city that had once been clothed in art stripped itself bare. The Medici watched from exile. They were scattered, living in Rome, in Venice, in foreign courts. Their bank declined. Their fortunes seemed to shrink. And yet, even then, their story was not over. For Florence without the Medici was never quite stable. The city swayed between republican pride and the practical need for strong leadership. And the Medici, though absent, remained woven into its identity. In 1512, with the help of allies and papal armies, the Medici returned. They did not march in as conquerors, but as restorers. Their exile had given them a new story, not oppressors, but saviors of Florence from chaos. Cosimo's caution, Lorenzo's magnificence, these memories lingered. And so the family reclaimed its place, carefully, step by step. But the Florence they returned to was not the same. The world itself was shifting. The Reformation spread across Europe. Empires clashed. The age of small city-states, proud but fragile, was fading. To survive, the Medici would need to rebrand again. And so they did. By the mid-16th century, the family shed the skin of mere Florentine bankers and patrons. They stepped into a new role, sovereigns. In 1537, Cosimo I de' Medici, only 17 years old, became Duke of Florence. At first, few believed he could hold such power. But Cosimo proved formidable. He centralized authority, tamed rival families, and built a standing army. Florence was no longer only a republic in disguise. It was now, openly, a state under Medici rule. And yet Cosimo understood, as his ancestors had, that force alone could not secure power. He turned again to rebranding. He clothed his authority not only in laws, but in symbols. He commissioned Giorgio Vasari to paint and build, filling Florence with frescoes and palaces that celebrated Medici glory. He expanded the Uffizi, originally built as government offices, which would later become one of the world's greatest galleries. He strengthened alliances through marriage, binding Florence to the courts of Europe. In 1569, Cosimo was granted a new title by the Pope, Grand Duke of Tuscany. It was more than a title. It was a transformation. The family that had begun as merchants, who had risen as bankers, who had ruled Florence through patronage and politics, were now sovereign rulers, crowned not by the people but by divine recognition. Their authority stretched beyond the walls of Florence, across the hills and valleys of Tuscany. This reinvention secured the Medici legacy for another 2 centuries. Grand dukes expanded palaces, collected art, married into royal families. Florence, though no longer a republic, remained radiant. The Medici name, though changed in form, still shaped the city's destiny. But decline would come again. As the centuries turned, the Medici line weakened. Grand dukes grew distant, more interested in ceremony than leadership. The once mighty bank was long gone. The family's direct male line ended in the 1700s, and Florence eventually passed into the hands of foreign powers. Yet even in decline, the Medici endured, not in flesh, but in memory. Their palaces still stand, their libraries still hold books, their galleries still glow with masterpieces. Florence itself remains their monument. Few families in history have vanished from politics yet remained so present in spirit. The lesson is simple. Families, like empires, survive through reinvention. The Medici survived exile by returning as saviors. They survived shifting times by becoming dukes. They survived even extinction by leaving behind a legacy so strong that centuries cannot erase it. Their power was not a single flame, burning brightly and then gone. It was a fire that shifted from torch to torch, changing hands, changing forms, but never fully extinguished. And so the Medici, though mortal, clothed themselves in the garments of immortality, not through crowns or swords, but through their endless ability to rebrand. Chapter 6: The Last Medici and the Legacy. Every dynasty reaches its twilight. For the Medici, who had risen from bankers to patrons, from patrons to dukes, and from dukes to popes, the 18th century brought the slow setting of their sun. The family that had once filled Florence with art, clothed Rome with splendor, and bound Tuscany beneath their rule now dwindled. One by one, the great branches of the lineage withered. The proud line of men who had carried the name through centuries grew thin. By the early 1700s, only a few remained, their power more ceremonial than real, their presence more shadow than flame. The last Medici Grand Dukes ruled a Florence that was no longer the fiery republic of rival families, nor the radiant Renaissance stage of Lorenzo's day. The city was quieter, its politics subdued, its destiny tied more to Europe's shifting empires than to its own independence. The Medici still held court, but the grandeur was dimmed. They presided more like caretakers of memory than creators of new glory. In 1737, the line ended. Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, the last of her house, left no heirs. With her, the blood of the family that had ruled Florence for nearly 300 years came to an end. The Medici dynasty, as a living force, was over. And yet, the story did not end there. Anna Maria Luisa understood something profound, that while dynasties end, legacies can endure. Before her death, she made a pact, known as the Family Pact. She decreed that the treasures of the Medici, the paintings, the sculptures, the manuscripts, the collections housed in palaces and galleries, would never leave Florence. They would remain forever in the city, for the people, for the world. It was a gift greater than gold, a final act of patronage that ensured the Medici name would live not through descendants, but through memory. Because of this pact, the Uffizi Gallery stands today as one of the world's greatest museums, its halls filled with the works the Medici once commissioned and collected. Botticelli's Birth of Venus, Leonardo's early paintings, Caravaggio's shadows, Raphael's Grace, all remain in Florence, part of a collection that speaks not only of art but of power rebranded into legacy. The Medici libraries, too, endured, their manuscripts preserved, their shelves heavy with the wisdom of ages. Scholars from across the world still open volumes once touched by their hands. The family that once counted coins and contracts left behind instead a treasury of knowledge. And Florence itself, more than any single building or gallery, carries the Medici name. To walk its streets is to walk through their story. The dome of Brunelleschi, financed by Cosimo. The palaces along the Via Larga, raised by their wealth. The chapels adorned with marble and frescoes, commissioned in their memory. Even the stones of the city are bound to them. Florence is, in a way, their monument. Other dynasties have risen and fallen. Other families have ruled, fought, and vanished. But few left behind such an indelible mark. The Medici understood what many rulers did not, that armies fade, that crowns tarnish, but culture endures. A sword rusts, but a painting glows. A throne is toppled, but a dome continues to catch the sun. The lesson of the Medici's final chapter is clear. True power is not only in ruling the present, but in shaping the memory of the future. To leave behind not just wealth, but a story. Not just titles, but a city transformed. The Medici line ended, but their story did not. Their name lingers on every canvas in the Uffizi, on every book in their libraries, on every stone that catches the Florentine light. They are gone, yet they remain. And so the quiet truth is revealed. Mortality comes to all, but legacy is chosen. The Medici chose theirs well. Florence will forever be branded by their name. And so, our journey with the Medici comes to its quiet end. We have walked the streets of Florence at dusk. We have stepped into chapels painted with light, into libraries filled with ancient words, into palaces where voices once whispered of coins and contracts. We have seen how power does not always come with a crown or a throne. Sometimes it moves more softly. Sometimes it hides in ledgers. Sometimes it shines in paintings. Sometimes it glows in the marble of a dome, or in the memory of a family name. The Medici remind us that power can be rebranded, reshaped, reborn. Giovanni began with banking, quiet, careful, deliberate. Cosimo transformed wealth into patronage, clothing Florence with art and architecture. Lorenzo turned culture into a shield, showing how beauty itself could defend a city. Their sons reached even into Rome, wearing papal robes, rebranding gold as holiness. And even in exile, even in decline, the Medici returned again and again, reinventing themselves until their very name became woven into Florence itself. In time, their line faded. The last Medici left no heirs. But by then, it hardly mattered, for Florence itself had become their heir. The city was their monument. Its galleries, its libraries, its streets, its skyline, all carried their story. Other rulers might be forgotten, their deeds buried in dust. But the Medici left behind a story that still glows. And that is the quiet lesson. True power does not always shout. It does not always march. It does not always wear a crown. True power endures when it leaves behind a memory, when it writes itself into culture, when it becomes part of the stones and songs of a city. The Medici are gone, but Florence whispers their name every day. And now, as we drift away from their story, we can let the city fade into twilight. The lanterns along its narrow streets grow dim. The Arno flows quietly in the dark, carrying the reflections of bridges and towers. The dome of the cathedral rests against the night sky, its great curve outlined faintly by the moon. Florence sleeps, and so may we. Let the weight of the day fall away. Let the noise quiet itself. There is nothing more to do now, no task to complete, no burden to carry. Only rest. Only peace. Only the gentle rhythm of breath, in and out, as steady as the river that has flowed beside Florence for centuries. And so, as Florence's lanterns dim, may these quiet lessons guide you into rest. May the story of the Medici remind you that strength can be soft, that power can be patient, that memory itself can be a form of immortality. If your eyes are still open, let them close. If they are already closed, let them grow heavier still. Sleep may come now, or later, but it will come, like dawn to the Arno, like evening to the piazzas, like silence to the streets. Good night. Good night from Florence. Good night from history. And may your dreams be gentle.